Let's take a step back in time. Picture it. The year is 1945. Japan's economy is completely obliterated. Resources are entirely depleted. And its manufacturing infrastructure? Well, it's really little more than bombed-out rubble. It is an environment of absolute, undeniable scarcity. But out of those very ashes, a massive mystery begins to unfold. Over the coming decades, an unrelenting, obsessive focus on process excellence would actually transform a struggling, resource-starved Japanese manufacturer into an absolute global titan. Today, in this explainer, we are unpacking a true phenomenon. We're going to explore exactly how Toyota built an empire, and get this, they didn't do it by having more money or more resources. They did it by having a fundamentally superior process. Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the scale of what happened, look across the ocean at the United States right after World War II. The booming automotive landscape was completely dominated by these untouchable giants in Detroit, think Ford, GM, and they operated on the pure brute force of mass production. They had what seemed like infinite resources, massive sprawling factories, and just undeniable scale. The prevailing mindset for the entire world was simple: build massive quantities, just push them out. But amidst that deeply entrenched environment, Toyota completely defied the norm. Actually, they had to. They literally couldn't outspend the American giants, so they had no choice but to completely rewrite the rules of manufacturing. They had to become the undisputed gold standard for efficiency. And the answer to how they pulled off this seemingly impossible feat lies in our first topic. Section 1, the efficiency revolution, changing the paradigm of production. To truly grasp the magnitude of this shift, you've got to look at the massive contrast between traditional manufacturing and the quiet revolution that was brewing over in Japan. The American way, the mass production way, was entirely obsessed with building the most cars. It was all about pushing sheer volume out the door as fast as humanly possible. But, what did that actually look like in practice? Well, it meant giant lots filled with excess, unsold inventory. It meant discovering widespread defects way too late in the process. It meant staggering amounts of wasted materials. Now, the Toyota way completely flipped this script. Their focus was entirely on building them the best way. And this wasn't just some clever temporary tactic for the factory floor. No, this was a deeply ingrained, survival-driven philosophy designed to secure a permanent, global competitive advantage. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. To achieve this new standard, they had to build a system entirely from the ground up. Let's look at Section 2, the two pillars of TPS, the foundation of the Toyota production system. The very first pillar of this foundation is just-in-time, or JIT. Now remember, the traditional industry standard relied on keeping massive warehouses completely stuffed with spare parts just sitting around gathering dust. Why? Well, because it felt safe. But Toyota realized that storing all those parts ties up millions in capital, requires massive real estate, and honestly, it hides deep-seated inefficiencies. So they took a huge risk. They shifted to making exactly what is needed, exactly when it is needed, and in the precise mathematical amount needed. It's a system of surgical precision designed to eliminate what they call muda, or waste. In the Toyota philosophy, waste is the ultimate enemy. Destroy the warehouses, destroy the waste. The second pillar is Jidoka. This essentially translates to automation, meaning automation with a human touch. Think back to the traditional nightmare of the mass production era. A factory wouldn't inspect its products until the very end of the line. Imagine the absolute horror of finding out hundreds or even thousands of finished vehicles all have the exact same misaligned door or faulty brake line. It's disastrous. Jidoka completely radicalized this by building quality checks directly into the manufacturing process, exactly as it happens. Imagine this playing out on a loud, bustling factory floor. The very moment a machine detects even a subtle anomaly, a literal red light flashes. Instantly, the entire multi-million-dollar assembly line grinds to a dramatic halt. They don't just push the error forward to meet some daily quota and cross their fingers that quality control catches it later. No way. Instead, the entire team swarms the problem, fixes the root cause right then and there, and redesigns the process to ensure that specific defect can never, ever happen again. But here's the thing. Brilliant machines and perfectly timed supply chains, they're only half the story. That brings us to Section 3, the power of Kaizen, the secret sauce of continuous improvement. Just 2 seconds. Picture a frontline assembly worker sweating on the factory floor back in the 1960s. They notice a slight, repetitive inefficiency at their station. After giving it some thought, they figure out a way to safely shave just 2 seconds off a single task. In a rigid, traditional 1960s corporate hierarchy, a manager would completely ignore them, right? The worker's job was just to turn the wrench. But at Toyota, every single employee, from that frontline worker all the way up to the CEO, is fundamentally empowered and fully expected to suggest these changes. Toyota actually listens to the 2-second ideas. And the math behind this is absolutely staggering. Think of it kind of like compound interest. A 2-second improvement doesn't look like a massive revolution on a random Tuesday. But layer thousands of these micro-improvements on top of each other, multiply them across tens of thousands of workers, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, the compounding math creates a massive, undeniable gap in quality and cost. It essentially builds an insurmountable moat around the business, brick by tiny brick. Competitors simply cannot copy decades of compounded human ingenuity overnight. Which naturally brings us to Section 4, Scaling Trust and Partnerships, Exporting Lean to the Supply Chain. We've looked inside Toyota's walls, but how in the world do they export this magic to outsiders? Now, what's really interesting here is the stark contrast in how they treated their vendors. Traditional manufacturers ruthlessly squeezed their suppliers for pennies. They viewed them as short-term transactions and forced them into these adversarial, highly isolated relationships where nobody shared secrets. Toyota did the exact opposite. They turned outsiders into true lean partners. They built deeply embedded long-term relationships. They integrated their incredibly precise just-in-time logistics across company lines and forged these shared ecosystems of mutual trust and respect. And building this ecosystem of trust is precisely what allowed them to scale. Because let's be honest, it is one thing to run a perfect, tightly knit system in your hometown of Nagoya, Japan. It is an entirely different, monumental feat of global cultural translation to enforce that exact same delicate, high-trust ecosystem on the other side of the planet in a massive manufacturing plant in Kentucky. But because of these deep partnerships, Toyota managed to export their exactingly high standards worldwide. So, seeing all of this, seeing the undeniable dominance it created, it brings up a massive, glaring question. If lean is so incredibly successful, and the blueprint is essentially public knowledge, just sitting right there for the taking, why doesn't every single company in the world just copy it? The answer is really just one word: culture. The true barrier to replicating Toyota's success isn't logistical at all. It isn't about having a multi-billion-dollar budget for cutting-edge robotics, and it isn't about buying the slickest supply chain software on the market. The barrier is entirely psychological. And that psychology leads us directly into Section 5, the cultural barrier to lean, radical transparency and admitting mistakes. You see, lean requires a level of transparency that, frankly, absolutely terrifies traditional corporate boardrooms. Let's dig into the ego and the fear here. In a traditional corporate mindset, stopping the assembly line is a punishable failure. It costs millions of dollars, it destroys the daily quota, and middle managers immediately scramble to point fingers and assign blame. But the Toyota mindset? Stopping the line is rewarded. It is actively celebrated as a golden opportunity to expose a hidden flaw and fix a problem forever. This absolute willingness to put corporate ego aside, face uncomfortable truths, and openly admit mistakes is exactly why competitors fail so miserably to replicate their success. But for those organizations brave enough to truly adopt this culture, the payoff is immense. Today, Toyota's lean strategy has completely transcended the automotive world. It's basically become the universal truth of process excellence. We see these exact same principles helping nurses reduce wasted time and save lives in crowded hospital emergency rooms. We see it guiding agile software developers to relentlessly test and ship clean, bug-free code. It proves that across any complex global industry, in a world of massive scale, your ultimate competitive advantage is your process. Which leaves us with a fascinating, provocative question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. In our modern era, an era entirely defined by artificial intelligence, complex algorithms, and hyper-automation, is Toyota's fundamentally human-centric philosophy still relevant? If every human worker is eventually replaced by a tireless machine, who will be left to pull the cord and suggest that 2-second improvement? It's definitely something to think deeply about as we build the factories of the future.